Let me just start by apologising to those of you who are here and those of you who are at home for the delay that has been this afternoon in starting up again. The reason for that, so that you know, is that there was a problem with being able to display the documents to you, to which Ms. Richards will refer during the course of a presentation. And maybe you wouldn't have wanted to listen to the presentation without having the documents that went with it and having to identify them by numbers and letters and tracing them afterwards. But we are, I gather, now in a position to begin, and what we'll do, so that you know, is we'll run straight through without having the usual afternoon break, and we'll save, therefore, about half an hour in the process, and so we won't lose too much time, I hope. But once again, I'm sorry.
So this afternoon's presentation, which I anticipate will probably continue over until tomorrow morning, focuses on the evidence of Dr. James Kemp Smith, usually referred to in contemporaneous documents as Dr. Jim Smith. Dr. Smith was not a clinician, he was a chemist working in the field of fractionation, and he worked in Edinburgh, in Oxford, and in Elstree. The presentation itself, I won't ask Paul to put it on the screen, but the reference for anyone who wants it is INQY 0000329, and it's also available on the Inquiry's website. It draws on, in particular, the following documents. And again, I'm going to read a handful of URNs, but we don't need to display them at present. So there is a witness statement that Dr. Smith provided to this inquiry in 2020. The reference for that is WITN 3433001. There is then a draft proof of evidence which Dr. Smith produced, or was produced for with the involvement of Dr. Smith during the HIV hemophilia litigation. The URN for that is CBLA 5016_034. There is also a transcript of evidence Dr. Smith gave to the Lindsay Tribunal, for which the reference is LIND 0000318. And then Dr. Smith gave evidence both in writing and orally to the Penrose inquiry. The references to his two written statements are PRSE 0004045 and PRSE 0004368. And then the references for his oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry are PRSE 0006059 and PRSE 0006060. I'll come to some aspects of that material in much more detail shortly. We're not able to hear oral evidence from Dr. Smith, and so the purpose of this presentation is really to draw out the key elements of the evidence that he has provided previously, and indeed the written statement he provided to the inquiry in 2020, and to explore a range of themes which emerge in his evidence. There are I think 7 themes or issues that I'm going to address through his evidence. Self-sufficiency, knowledge of risk of viral transmission, resources at PFL and BPL, the relationship between the fractionation centres in England and the fractionation centre in Scotland, some matters relating to pool sizes and in particular restricted pool trials, heat treatment, which I anticipate will be probably the longest part of the presentation, and then Dr. Smith's observations on the possibility of reversion to cryoprecipitate as a response to the AIDS crisis. So those are the particular themes that I'll aim to pick up by reference to Dr. Smith's statements and also by reference to some of the contemporaneous documents. In terms of his background, Dr. Smith studied chemistry, graduating in 1962 from the University of Edinburgh. He then studied for a PhD and then undertook postdoctoral studies, again based at the University of Edinburgh, through to 1968. Then between 1968 and 1975, he was based at the Protein Fractionation Centre in Edinburgh. He was a senior biochemist, then chief chemist, responsible, his evidence tells us, at overlapping times for product management, product development, and quality control of plasma protein concentrates. A little more detail about some aspects of his work is set out in a CV, which I think was prepared for the purposes of the Penrose inquiry. We don't need to put it up on screen, but it's PRSE 0001136. After those 7 or so years working at the PFC in Edinburgh, Dr. Smith moved to England and took up a post in 1975 at the Plasma Fractionation Laboratory in Oxford. He remained there until 1992. He worked as a scientist in charge of fractionation, responsible for product development and manufacturing, closely involved in research and development. And from January 1983, his job title was Chief Project Scientist. And he described in his evidence in various stages a close relationship between the PFL in Oxford and the Oxford Hemophilia Centre. For some 3 or so years during that time, he was seconded to BPL. So from 1979 to the end of 1982, as well as holding down his job at PFL, Dr. Smith took up additional duties as head of coagulation factor production with some research and development responsibilities at BPL. And according to his evidence, he would attend both laboratories for part of every day. So he travelling between Elstree and Oxford. He planned and oversaw remedial action at the BPL facility and was involved in the initiation at BPL of systems of batch documentation. In 1992, he ceased to work for PFL and became an independent consultant advisor on fractionation and coagulation until his retirement in 2015. So he had what may have been a unique experience as a fractionator of working at PFC, PFL and BPL, and we'll draw on some aspects of comparison that he offered in his evidence in due course. So if I can then turn to some of the evidence that he gave in writing at earlier stages, in the chronological order in which that evidence was prepared, we start with the draft proof of evidence in the HIV litigation. Paul, could we have up on screen, please, CBLA 5016_034. You will see this is a document for Dr. J.K. Smith, headed draft/proof of evidence. The top right-hand corner describes it as draft 3, and there is a date of the 1st of November 1990. It's important, therefore, to understand the context within which this document was produced. It was produced as part of the HIV haemophilia litigation. It was produced, as I understand it, at the request of, or at the behest of the solicitors representing the CBLA, Clifford Chance, and it was never finalised. And if we go to the very last page, should be page 70, we can see that it was not signed or dated. Before we look, however, a little more at what was in that statement, if we can just look at Dr. Smith's later observations on the accuracy of the statement and the procedure by which it was put together. That's in his statement to this inquiry from 2020, WITN 3433001. So this is statement 27th of July 2020 to this inquiry. If we go to page 4, he was asked about the draft proof of evidence that we've looked at, and indeed about an earlier draft, which is referred to in this document as draft 1. And I'm just going to read what he says about it. Starting with paragraph 12, he says, "The inquiry has provided me with a document headed with my name and entitled Draft Proof of Evidence Draft 1, and has suggested that this is a draft proof of evidence from the HIV hemophilia litigation. It's unsigned and undated. I do not today recall ever seeing draft 1, although the existence of draft 3 suggests that I must have. My only recollection of the apparent context is a single visit to the offices of Clifford Chance, who I believe were organising the defence for BPL and possibly others." Skipping over a sentence, "The style of some elements of the draft, particularly the last section, suggests that I've been asked for notes on various topics, probably in advance of this interview or conceivably just later, but I've no positive recollection of having been asked for or having provided notes." And then he has some other observations in relation to draft 1, which I don't think I need trouble with. The next paragraph, he explains that draft 3, and that's the draft that we'll be looking at today, is more recognisably in my words, but some of the wording in the commentaries is not mine, and there's evidence of dictation to a typist, not the PFL secretary. The context appears to be that, responding to the unidentified drafter's interpolations in draft 1, I provided small adjustments and explanations to draft 1. The main text of draft 3 continues to follow draft 1 and continues the narrative to the end of 1984. I would have thought that a full text might have continued until 1990, i.e. the time of the draft. Draft 3 continues with my commentaries attempting to explain to the lawyers the significance of mainly BPL internal memoranda. And I'll show shortly what he meant by that. And then if we go to paragraph 14, Dr. Smith said, "Draft 3 is not an ideal source of evidence, but it has the merit of being closer in time to the events described than were, e.g. my submissions to the Penrose inquiry in 2011. I found nothing in the narrative or the explanatory section which is contrary to my recollections, but there is much information here that I've not retained over 30 years and must simply take at face value." And then paragraph 15, he says, "Since the draft does not include any statement of its intended scope, I cannot judge whether it should have included other material. Although it does not continue to 1990, it does cover the most crucial years in BPL's development of safer concentrates. I get no impression of it attempting to hide or omit anything inconvenient and have no reason to think that this has occurred." So that in 2020 was Dr. Smith's recollection of the process by which the draft proof of evidence in 1990 was obtained, and those were his comments on it. If we go back then to the 1990 draft proof, draft 3, CBLA 5016_034, we'll see it's in 5 principal sections. If we turn to page 3, the first principal section is a history of the plasma fractionation laboratory, and I'll just go through that, although much of it predates Dr. Smith's employment there. He does explain the source of his knowledge, and we've seen, I think, a similar account in relation to BPL elsewhere. So he says, "The events described below, to the extent they predate my joining PFL in 1975, are based upon the recollections of Mr. G.W.R. Dyke." And then you'll see in brackets the word "still" to confirm this information, and that we anticipate is probably a comment from the solicitors who were involved in the drafting of the document. Who is a technical officer working in PFL, who was first employed by the then head of PFL, Dr. Ethel Bidwell, in the early 1950s. Mr. Dyke worked closely with Dr. Bidwell throughout the 1950s and 60s, and at the time I joined PFL in 1975, worked on research and development. And then you'll see that he was still employed, Mr. Dyke was still employed at PFL at the time of this statement. If we go over the page, we then have what essentially is Dr. Smith describing what Mr. Dyke had said to him about the history of PFL. His recollection is that in about 1937-38, the MRC, so the Medical Research Council, were charged by the government with responsibility for developing therapeutic concentrates utilising blood and plasma. It's believed that the MRC quickly subcontracted this work, at least to the extent that it applied to freeze-dried plasma, to the Lister Institute, which was then based in Chelsea Bridge Road in London. In 1951, Dr. R.G. Macfarlane and Dr. Biggs started research on thrombosis and coagulation disorders in the Radcliffe Infirmary's pathology laboratory funded by Oxford University, at least partly through the Nuffield Hemophilia Research Fund and the United Oxford Hospitals. In fact, Mr. Dyke was first employed at the Radcliffe Infirmary. In 1952, Dr. Ethel Bidwell was employed to investigate the possibility of making therapeutic factor VIII concentrates, at this time in the form of AHG, anti-hemophiliac globulin, from animal plasma. In 1956, bovine AHG was used for the first time in a major operation. Porcine AHG was also used for the first time in 1958, and other species such as sheep and horse were investigated during this period. Up to this point, any policy on manufacture and use of the therapeutic products rested with Oxford University, the physicians of the United Oxford Hospitals, and the Wingfield Morris Orthopaedic Centre. In 1958, the MRC formed the MRC Blood Coagulation Research Unit under the directorship of Dr. Macfarlane at the Churchill Hospital in Oxford. The policy of the unit and its funding became the responsibility of the MRC. There were 3 divisions in the unit: research, clinical and fractionation. The latter included biochemical research work. At the time it was formed, the MRC central workshops were already on the Churchill Hospital site. In 1962, the blood transfusion service moved to the Churchill Hospital site as well, and as a consequence, more significant volumes of human plasma became available for fractionation in 5-litre batches. In 1962, cooperation between the MRC unit biochemical section under Dr. Ethel Bidwell and the Lister Institute under the direction of Dr. later Sir William Maycock took place with regard to the provision of crude plasma residue for factor IX concentrate, C9 as it was then called, from the ether fractionation process for the production of factor VIII at Elstree. Concurrent with the preparation of factor IX, immunological and biochemical research was carried out into the nature of factor VIII, including its separation from fibrinogen. Bovine and porcine factor VIII was still in use, and much work was carried out into the nature of and avoidance of development of inhibitors to factor VIII caused by the infusion of heterologous factor VIII. In 1968, Dr. Macfarlane retired, and the MRC policy dictated that the unit should close. MRC policy at the time was to funding only frontline as opposed to applied research. Research once established and in a position to be applied was passed to the Health Authority. Dr. Ethel Bidwell gave consideration to whether the fractionation laboratory might be taken over by the Health Authority or by the Lister Institute, and it was eventually agreed that the latter style of management would be more appropriate. The BCRU has split into 3 sections: 1, Hemophilia Centre, operated by NHS but with a continuing MRC role; 2, Plasma Fractionation Laboratory under blank, and then over the page research under the MRC only. Plasma Fractionation Laboratory performed as a research pilot plant on an intermediate scale for the preparation of a number of human blood plasma fractions, principally factor 8, 2, 7, 9 and 10, immunoglobulins and albumin. All PFL staff except Mr. Dyke were employed by the Lister Institute. Then he says Dr. Bidwell became responsible to Dr. Maycock of BPL. Finally, for current purposes, paragraph 14, by 1972, almost all the factor VIII preparations produced by PFL were used by the Oxford Hemophilia Centre, and the clinical trials of the DE factor IX preparation were underway in Oxford. DE factor IX was being developed to replace the then current factor IX concentrate C9. However, C9 continued in production alongside DE9 until 1975, as DE9 did not contain factor VII, which was needed by a few patients. In 1976, a factor VII preparation was developed and underwent clinical trials in Oxford, Spain and Italy. Thereafter, production of C9 was stopped. During this period and until 1978, the factor VIII concentrate produced by PFL was a low-potency intermediate purity product, 8IP. In 1978, 8CRV, and you've heard that referred to by Mr. Hill in the course of the presentation this week, the CRV standing for cooled reduced volume, and HL, higher potency intermediate purity products were put into production. And just pausing there, HCRV from 1978 was the factor VIII concentrate produced at PFL until it was replaced by HY in 1985. HL was the factor VIII concentrate produced by BPL, again, until it was replaced by HY in 1985. By the time we get to the early 1980s, the factor IX product is more commonly referred to as 9D. So there's a potted history from Dr. Smith in relation to the establishment in Oxford. The second part of this draft proof starts on the next page, and you will see it contains an explanation from Dr. Smith of various terms associated with the process of fractionation. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just point out what we have. So he explains pasteurization, referred to elsewhere, as Mr. Hill has already referred, as sometimes as wet heating. He then describes the process of dry heating. And then over the page, I don't think we need to worry about precipitation for present purposes, but if we go to the next page, he describes two further concepts, recovery/yield and purity, both of which will become of some relevance when we look at the experimental work in relation to heat treatment. And then over the page, we see there the reference at paragraph 27 to solvent, detergent. Again, that's one of the possible areas that were explored by a PFL. And then on the next page, we see in paragraph 29, he deals with the problem of thrombogenicity in relation to factor IX concentrates. And I'll come back to that when we look at the heat treatment process in relation to factor IX. The next part of Dr. Smith's draft proof starts over the page, page 12. And here he set out an account of the work that was undertaken principally at PFL in relation to the development of the heat treatment process. I'm going to come back to that in some detail at a later stage of the presentation, but that runs from page 12 to page 34 of this draft proof. If we move on then to page 39 of the draft proof, sorry, 35 of the draft proof, my apologies. Sorry, previous page, Paul. Sorry, page 34. You'll see there, Sarah, heading Restricted Pool Factor VIII Trials, 1983 to 1984. Again, I'll come back to that, but Dr. Smith essentially set out in the draft proof here a particular component of the work at PFL, in particular in relation to or response to hepatitis in the period 1983 to 84, in relation to what's sometimes called limited pool or restricted pool, or sometimes referred to as small panel trials. And I'll explain what was meant by that in due course. If we then turn to page 39, we have the last section of Dr. Smith's draft proof. And this is a commentary on various documents. They're documents from, as we can see from the heading, the CBLA's discovery, so documents it was disclosing as part of the HIV hemophilia litigation. And for the remainder of the statement, if we just go over the page, for example, we see on the bottom half of the page a number and then a description by Dr. Smith of the document. For the most part, this final section of the draft proof really does little more than summarise the document. But from time to time, Dr. Smith did add some commentary or some context to the document. It's not clear, and the same will be true when we look at Dr. Lane's draft proof of evidence sometime tomorrow, it's not clear who made the selection of documents. In other words, on what basis were particular documents put before Dr. Smith or put before Dr. Lane, and whether it was a selection to which they contributed or whether it was a selection on the part of the legal representatives. So that's the draft proof of evidence in the HIV haemophilia litigation. As I say, I'll come back to what he said in this draft proof in relation to heat treatment and the restricted pool trials in due course. So that was 1990, obviously closer in time to the events in question than any of the later evidence. The next occasion upon which Dr. Smith gave evidence...
You did say, I think, there were 5 sections to that, and you've told me about 4.
So the
first was the history of PFL.
The terminology...
The terminology, right, that's it.
Yes, heat treatment, restricted pool, and then the commentary. So the next, chronologically, the next piece of evidence from Dr. Smith was his evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal. He gave oral evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal on the 18th of July 2001. Paul, can we have, please, LIND 40318? So you'll see here the first page of the transcript of the oral evidence, and we see the date at the top, and then Dr. Smith was questioned. We don't, I am afraid, have a copy of the written report or statement that Dr. Smith provided to the Lindsay Tribunal. There is reference in the course of the oral evidence to there having been a written document, but we don't have it. And when Dr. Smith provided this inquiry with his statement in 2020, he no longer had it either. Unsurprisingly, the oral evidence that Dr. Smith gave to the Lindsay Tribunal largely covered issues of particular relevance to Ireland. It covered the extent to which the PFC in Edinburgh could have fractionated Irish plasma and produced factor concentrates for Ireland. In other words, the arrangement that we know was subsequently set in place in relation to Northern Ireland. A question was explored with Dr. Smith as to whether that could have been undertaken in relation to Ireland. He was asked about the extent of his contact with fractionators and clinicians in Ireland. He was asked about a particular element of work undertaken at PFL on something called the Gale-Rock method of attempting to increase the yield of factor 8. But he was also asked about PFL's work on exploring pasteurisation and dry heating. And for your notes, and for anyone else who wants to look at that, that's covered largely from page 10 onwards of the oral transcript. I will just, whilst we're looking at this, show you the question and answer session in relation to could Scotland have fractionated Irish plasma, because that has some relevance to an issue you may need to consider, sir, as to whether the PFC could have been used as a resource for the fractionation of plasma from England and Wales. So if we pick that up at page 3 of this transcript, you'll see, however, it's apparent from Dr. Smith's answers that he can only really assist with the position relating to PFC up to 1975. So it's about halfway down the page. There is a question I see. Now, if I can go back to the situation with Scotland, and again, you were only there up to 1975, was there, or could the Scottish Centre have fractionated Irish plasma and produced factor 8 and factor 9 for Ireland at that time? And then this was Dr. Smith's answer. In the technical sense, I think that could have been done and was quite an attractive option for the Scottish Centre. There may have been certain difficulties in that, however. In other cases, what you might call contract fractionation would have been done. There was pressure from the regulatory authorities in Ireland, the donor or the fractionating nation, to ensure that the streams of the two plasmas were kept separate. And that would have raised difficulties even in the new centre in Edinburgh. Question, perhaps we'll break it down into pieces. If the country which was sending the plasma insisted on separate streams in the sense of keeping their plasma separate from other plasma in the Scottish Centre, Would that have caused some difficulty? Answer, it would have made it increase the difficulty of factor 8 and factor 9 production quite a bit, but it would have been very, very difficult with the larger fractions, IgG and albumin, with the system that Scotland was running at the time. Question, if we just deal with the factor 8 and factor 9, while it would have rendered it perhaps more difficult, would it have been an impossible situation? Answer, not impossible. Question, I see. Now, the other possibility is what I might describe as a shared system, which I presume means that the Irish plasma would have gone in with other plasma, and that the product would have been produced at the end, which represented a shared source. Just pausing there, that's what Dr. Maurice McClellan told us was what happened in relation to the Northern Irish plasma. It was pooled with Scottish plasma. Answer, yes. Over the page, was that a possibility? Answer, that would have been more practical, I believe, from the Scottish point of view. Question, I see, I think you said that this would have had some attractions from the Scottish point of view. Why do you say that? Answer, the Scottish Centre was built with an eye on fractionating more plasma than was currently available from Scotland, although Scotland was one of the most prolific countries in getting plasma out of the transfusion service. Part of the idea at the time was that the English Centre was becoming more elderly and that we might receive, there were certainly proposals to receive English plasma from the north of England, more naturally, more nearly going into the Scottish Centre. Nothing came of that. Another possibility might have been to seek plasma from other countries of a similar size to Scotland. Question, in other words, did you in Scotland have capacity to deal with more plasma and were sort of looking around the place to see was there a possibility of getting plasma from other places? Answer, yes, it improves the economies of fractionation if you utilise your capacity to the fullest. He's then asked specifically a question about whether there were discussions in relation to Irish plasma, and he says, I can't recall. The next question is whether arrangements with any other countries or any other areas in regard to contract fractionation by the Centre in Edinburgh, and Dr. Smith said if there were, he didn't know of them. And then he's asked if he knew why discussions with Ireland never came to any actual arrangements, and he answers he did not, and then he left in 1975. So that's some contextual evidence in relation to his understanding of the position as at the PFC in Edinburgh in the first half of the 1970s when Dr. Smith was there. That was Dr. Smith's evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal. He then provided 2 written statements to the Penrose inquiry. The first is at PRSE 00040045. This is a statement dated the 22nd of June 2011, and it addressed the Penrose inquiry's topic B3, which was viral inactivation in the period to 1985. And you will see from this that Dr. Smith gave a statement in what he described as 3 parts. The first, snapshots and landmarks, that's a reference to a document produced by the Penrose inquiry to which, or on which Dr. Smith provided comments. And then the second part of his statement was what he referred to as notes, JKS, so that's his initials, notes 1 to 5. And then the third part of his evidence was some comments on specific paragraphs of the Penrose preliminary report. I'm not going to go through this in detail, although we'll come back to some parts of it. But if we can just look over the page, we'll see what he meant by this. So this document contains in ordinary print the observations and questions posed by the Penrose inquiry, and then that which you see in bold italics are Dr. Smith's observations in response. If we then go on to page 17, please, we will see the supplemental notes which Dr. Smith produced. And for present purposes, I want to come back to one or two of them later. I'm just going to show you what the subject of each of those notes was. So his first note was headed Impediments to the Development of Heat Treatment Against Non-A, Non-B Hepatitis. And we'll come back to this, but he listed a whole range of factors which he suggested were impediments to any earlier heat treatment work. If we go over the page, his second note is headed Pasteurisation of albumin is not directly transferable to factor VIII. So essentially, in a nutshell, explaining there why it's not simply a question of saying, well, we do this with albumin, let's do it with factor VIII, and he explained why in the note. The next note on page 19, so the next page, note 3, is headed The Clinical Trial of PFC's First Pasteurised Factor VIII and its Impact on the Pasteurisation Programme. Now, obviously, by this time, Dr. Smith was firmly based in Oxford and Elstree, no longer involved in work in the PFC in Edinburgh. So this was Dr. Smith's comments and observations from his external perspective on aspects of the work being undertaken in Edinburgh. Over the page, his fourth note is headed, Why did fractionators in Scotland and England take different decisions on heat treatment of factor VIII? And obviously we'll be hearing from Dr. Foster directly next week about the Scottish decision-making in that regard, and we'll look in more detail this afternoon or tomorrow morning about the direction taken by English fractionators. But that's Dr. Smith's account in any event of his understanding of why there was a different course taken. And then his fifth note at page 23, towards the bottom of the page, is headed Clinical Trials of 8Y, self-explanatory. That's a short narrative account by Dr. Smith. And then the final part of this first statement to the Penrose inquiry starts on page 26. And you'll see it's headed Some Remarks on Specific Sections of the Preliminary Report. And then the paragraph numbers that are there listed are the paragraph numbers in the Preliminary Penrose Report. And Dr. Smith sets out some elements of agreement, disagreement, or additional observation. There are a couple of passages in that. I might come back to it at a later stage. The second statement which Dr. Smith provided to the Penrose inquiry is at PRSE 0004368. This was a statement dated the 29th of August 2011, and this addressed the Penrose inquiry's topic C3, which was hepatitis C and viral inactivation in the period 1985 to 1987. And you'll see again, he set out on this first page that his contribution was in three parts. The first was responses to the inquiry's specific questions. The second was a further note authored by Dr. Smith, his note 6. And then the third were annotations on a chronology that had been produced by the Penrose inquiry. And if I just show you what they are, because again, we might need to come back to some of this. If we go to the next page, you'll see there the first part of Dr. Smith's response to the Penrose inquiry. And if we go to the bottom of the page, you'll see this time it's in slightly fainter print, but italicised, that we have Dr. Smith's answers to or observations on the matters being raised by the Penrose inquiry. It's a bit clearer if we go to the next page. So the italics represents what Dr. Smith was saying by way of response. If we go over to page 8, we see there Dr. Smith's 6th supplemental note. The topic of this note was collaboration between PFC and PFL/BPL in the period 1981 to 1987, and I'll be coming back to some aspects of that. And then the third part of his response on this occasion to the Penrose inquiry is a separate document. It's at PRSE 0002057. And you'll see it's headed Dr. Smith's comments on C3 viral inactivation chronology. So it's a chronology compiled by the Penrose inquiry. Dr. Smith's comments on some items in the chronology are shown in italics. And there'll be a couple of those, his specific comments, that I'll want to come back to in the course of the presentation. As I indicated at the outset, Dr. Smith also gave oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry. I'm not proposing to go to the transcripts of his oral evidence, but the dates of his oral evidence were the 1st and 2nd of November 2011. I've already given the reference numbers. For the most part, his oral testimony does not add significantly to what he had already told the Penrose inquiry in writing, although obviously there were aspects of his written statements that were expanded. And then finally, in terms of his written material, we have the statement to this inquiry. We don't need to put it up on screen for present purposes, but the principal issues addressed in his statement to this inquiry are as follows, and I'll be looking at all of them in the course of the presentation. Knowledge of risk of viral transmission, which is pages 9 to 20 of his inquiry witness statement. Heat treatment, pages 20 to 40 of the inquiry statement. Issues relating to pools and restricted pools trials, pages 41 to 55 of his inquiry statement, and self-sufficiency, which he addresses in pages 55 to 61 of his inquiry statement. So we'll look at some aspects of those, of his evidence in the course of the afternoon or tomorrow morning. So against that introduction, which I hope will enable both you, sir, and those who are listening, and in particular perhaps recognised legal representatives, to navigate their way around the various different forms in which we have evidence from Dr. Smith. I'm going to turn to the first theme that I wanted to address, which is that of self-sufficiency, and what Dr. Smith had to say about self-sufficiency in his various statements. Now, as a chemist and scientist, the achievement of self-sufficiency for England and Wales was not the principal focus of Dr. Smith's work. Nonetheless, as a fractionator who worked in both Scotland and England, he had a perspective to offer. And it's right to note he was also a member of a working party on self-sufficiency in blood products set up by Dr. Gunson. And we can see that if we look, first of all, at CBLA 5016_034. This is back in the 1990 draft proof of evidence. If we go to page paragraph 110, page 50, this was in the context of the section of his statement in which he comments on particular documents. Dr. Smith said this: at the time I sent this memorandum, Dr. Gunson was about to become a ministerial advisor on blood transfusion, and he set up a working party for self-sufficiency in blood products. One of its tasks was to consider how to increase the amount of plasma available to the fractionation centre. The idea was that blood was taken from more donors and a higher percentage could be used as components. That committee, of which I was a member, took a year or so to report. One of our tasks was trying to predict the amounts of plasma that would be required in order to achieve self-sufficiency in factor 8. There was some disparity between the plasma needed for factor 8 production and other blood products such as albumin on the one hand and the need for red cells on the other. And then he talked about the process of plasmapheresis. It says, at the time I wrote this memorandum, Dr. Gunson was setting up trials on plasmapheresis, made a number of visits to Europe to see what the Europeans were doing. Although at the time plasmapheresis seemed a very expensive way of obtaining plasma, the memorandum does show that the NHS and DHSS were determined to set realistic goals for Factor VIII and to adopt measures which would achieve those goals. Doctors Gunson and Robinson were the more energetic of the Hemophilia Centre directors at that time, and that's obviously an error because they're regional transfusion directors, not Hemophilia Centre directors. And not all of the directors were enthusiastic about introducing plasmapheresis simply in order to collect plasma for Factor VIII. So that's an observation from the 1990 statement. In terms of Dr. Smith's own involvement with this working party, there are two documents just to show you. The first is CBLA 0001313. This is a memo from Dr. Smith to Dr. Lane, March 1981. We see the heading there, Working Party for Self-Sufficiency in Blood Products. And Dr. Smith is observing that Dr. Gunson has put Dr. Smith down to address problems relating to albumin and anti-D, as well as coagulation factors. If we just go over the page, we get a sense of what Dr. Smith's involvement in the working party may have been. The heading on the document is information required by the working party. And then we can see in relation to the information that Dr. Smith is being asked to provide, paragraph 4.1.3, volume of plasma required for fractionation. That's against Dr. Smith's name. If we go further down the page to 4.1.5, production aspects, type of Factor VIII preparation, presentation of raw material, capacity for preparation of albumin products after 1982. Again, Dr. Smith's being asked to provide information in relation to that. And then if we go to the next page, we can see he's down to provide information at the top of the page on agreed standards for starting material and finished products. And then towards the bottom of the page, phasing of increase in plasma supplies is paragraph 4.1.8. Dr. Smith has been asked to provide information relating to stocks required for introducing increased development. And then I don't think I need to show you over the page because that's concerned with specific immunoglobulins. And then just one further document, CBLA 301377. So you'll see there, this is, again, refers to the working party established by Dr. Gunson. This is a preliminary report, and we can see Dr. Smith is down as a member of the working party. If we just look at the very bottom of the page, we can see the date of the preliminary report, June 1981. And then over the page, there's a summary which continues to the next page. I'm not proposing to go through it. The purpose of introducing this document, apart from so that you sir, and others can see that the document exists, is just to suggest that Dr. Smith did have some contemporaneous involvement in deliberations relating to self-sufficiency. If we then go to what Dr. Smith said about self-sufficiency in his statement to this inquiry, so if we can go back, please, Paul, to WITN 3433001. And if we pick it up at page 57, we start at the bottom of the page, you will see that the inquiry asked Dr. Smith his views about reasons why the UK did not become self-sufficient. And this was his response. The concept of UK underlying self-sufficiency is an empty one. Although national self-sufficiency in blood products was strongly endorsed by WHO, and the reference he gives there is to the WHO's May 1975 resolution, no one could claim that the principle and its consequent responsibilities were embraced as energetically in England as in Scotland. I believe that at some decision-making levels, illegal governmental assistance and restraint of trade were adduced as serious impediments despite EU's adoption of the WHO position. And the reference there, sir, for your note, is to the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers recommendation of April 1980. At the clinical level, where the other important decisions were made, an influential group of Hemophilia Centre directors saw it as limiting a clinician's choice of the best product available for his patient. Scottish clinicians, no less fervent for their patients' welfare, seem to cope with that challenge. And then he continues again, drawing on his experience from being both in Scotland and in England. Says this: coming from Edinburgh to Oxford in 1975, I was shocked by this lack of appetite for self-sufficiency at a national level. The situation I found in Oxford already provided a worked example of commitment and coordination, which might have been adopted with local adjustment in any of the English regions. The Oxford Hemophilia Centre in Churchill Hospital treated many more patients than average, partly because families with haemophilia migrated to the centre, which under Dr. McFarlane and Dr. Biggs had always offered more generous treatment from the beginning, partly too because it attracted some of the hardest cases, often from farther afield, including those needing innovative surgery, also carried out in Churchill Hospital by Professor Duffy. About 50 metres from the Haemophilia Centre, and working under the most trying conditions, Dr. Grant and later Dr. Gunson at Oxford Regional Transfusion Centre made heroic efforts to provide the fresh plasma for PFL's production of factor VIII, all of which went next door to the Haemophilia Centre. I was never given a convincing technical reason why, with BPL playing the role of PFL in the virtuous triangle, I'll come back to that phrase in a moment, the same could not have been done in every region long before the surge in about 1982. Some pointed to the possible merits of establishing a national blood transfusion service in more than name only, and the references there are to Dr. Cash's article in the BMJ in 1987 about the state of the blood transfusion service in England and Wales, and some of the responses that followed. The phrase virtuous triangle is not one that we've encountered elsewhere. What I have understood it to be describing is a description of a triangular relationship, an equal relationship between three bodies: the Oxford Regional Transfusion Centre, the PFL in Oxford, and the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. And he's suggesting that is, as I understand it, is a worked example of local self-sufficiency. And he's saying he can see no good reason why that could not have been something replicated on a wider stage in England and Wales. That's how I read the statement. It's obviously a matter for you, sir, in due course to consider.
Yes, the question then is BPL. He plainly envisages BPL as a national, that is English and Welsh national body, playing the role of PFL. So it's giving as much plasma as you can to BPL making the stuff and passing it back. What's the particular feature about Oxford that makes it successful, in his view, which didn't apply to the arrangements as they were?
This is, in one sense, speculation on my part, but it picks up upon some of the things that Dr. Smith said elsewhere in parts of his evidence. There was he describes this on a number of occasions, a very close, practical working relationship between the three corners of the triangle in Oxford. So Dr. Smith described elsewhere weekly, sometimes more frequent encounters with Dr. Ritzer. He describes having a much more vivid understanding of the realities of haemophilia treatment than may have been the case at BPL or indeed in regional transfusion centres. So it's the closeness of the relationship, the symbiotic relationship between the three, which I think he may be referring to. Hence, possibly the relevance of that last sentence, which is referring back then to the criticisms that we've explored on a number of occasions, so about the lack of a cohesive blood transfusion service, the 14 fiefdoms, as they've sometimes been described, or autonomous centres. The absence of the overarching national structure, or as Mr. Hill was talking about earlier in the week, some form of executive body. Elsewhere in his evidence, Dr. Smith made a point, I think it's in one of his commentaries in his Penrose evidence, he made a point of saying that CBLA had no relationship with the regional transfusion centres and no authority over them. So it may well be that those are the kinds of matters that he had in mind when he wrote this paragraph. That would certainly be consistent with observations he made elsewhere.
And that might go back, I suppose, to this second sentence in that paragraph. After his expression of being shocked, Oxford was a worked example of commitment and coordination.
Yes.
So he's looking for commitment and coordination, which he sees as being absent nationally. It looks as though that's because he thinks, well, people aren't really, their heart's not in it, is what he seems to be saying. Possibly,
sir. And certainly, he's certainly drawing a distinction on interview between Scotland, on the one hand, of which he had obviously some personal experience, and England and Wales. And then he's drawing a distinction between what he sees in Oxford, this virtuous triangle, to use that somewhat curious phrase, and the rest of England and Wales. And those are the words he uses. You're right, sir, commitment and coordination.
Yes.
He then goes on in the next paragraph to say, PFC was virtually, so again talking about the Edinburgh fractionation plant, PFC was virtually always able to meet the core Scottish demand for their Factor 8 and Factor 9. The reference there, sir, is to a report from Dr. Foster to the Penrose inquiry. We'll be looking at that with Dr. Foster next week, no doubt. England could make the heavily nuanced claim in 1985 only because so many clinicians were choosing to buy imported products. The BPL claim became progressively more realistic after 1987 due to a better balance between the regional transfusion centres and BPL's efforts and BPL's development of more attractive Factor 8 products, only to see them preempted by the UK HCD's recommendation in 1997 that the UK Hemophilia Centre should use only recombinant coagulation factors in which BPL had not invested. The VCJD disaster of the late 1990s dealt the killing blow to the regrettably brief cooperation between the RTCs and BPL.
So again, he's coming back to the theme of a lack of cooperation.
Yes, absolutely. And then, if we go over the page, there are three more paragraphs in his statement, which four more paragraphs in the statement on this topic, which it's instructive to read. So paragraph 167, from about 1982, the regional transfusion centres did all that was asked of them and were not the limiting factor in the provision of Factor 8 to England and Wales. So contrasting the position before 1982 with what he perceived from around 1982. And then this, given a suspended death sentence in 1979, that's no doubt a reference to the medicines inspection, BPL had to push the capacity of the old coagulation factor plant to its creaky limits until 1987, then began to catch up with demand fairly quickly in the new B27. Although calculations of demand had varied rather widely, the design capacity of the new coagulation factor plant was adequate and even accommodated several challenging changes of product and processes until BPL ceased to be a national asset. Throughout the 1970s, the Hemophilia Centre directors, often with Dr. Biggs or Dr. Ritzer of Oxford Hemophilia Centre as their spokesperson, faithfully kept their projections of demand up to date and ever more emphatic. The upward trajectory of demand, accelerated at times by new concepts such as prophylaxis and home therapy, could at any time have been extrapolated to the likely date of commissioning a new building and therefore a decision-making process. We were constantly being reminded that it was not DH practice to spend large sums on speculations. The design of the new BPL coagulation factor plant had to take appropriate cognizance of this.
Yeah, can you just help me with that? What is he seeing in what does he mean? What practical effect, as you see in the sentence, the upward trajectory of demand, accelerated at times by such as prophylaxis and chemotherapy, could at any time have been extrapolated, thus extrapolating the upward trajectory of demand, to the likely date of commissioning a new building, and therefore a decision-making process. Is he saying that you can plot where demand is going to go? We know when, we assume that you know when you're going to commission a new building. You can plan for the in-between and what you use in the in-between period, or what's he saying?
He may be saying that. He may be saying he may be saying it could and should have been predicted and therefore reflected in an appropriate decision-making process on the part of the Department of Health. That self-sufficiency was only going to be achieved with an earlier decision to
that we needed earlier.
Placement BPL.
Yeah.
That, in broad terms, that is how I had read this paragraph.
I think you may well be right. I mean, there are different ways of reading it, but I think that interpretation sounds the better. Yours, that is.
Yes. And obviously we can't, I'm afraid, ask Dr. Smith.
But this is obviously open to submission in due course, if anyone wants to submit about it.
Absolutely. And then paragraph 169, and this I think perhaps may reinforce the understanding of the previous paragraph. He says this: the political climate at the turn of the 1980s was not naturally favourable to expenditure in the public service. Once convinced that in fact a modern fractionation service could be a sound investment even in cash terms, considering the high market prices of imported plasma products and the huge advantages of an unpaid donor source, the government of the day accepted the necessity to make provision. The initial proposal was for private industry to take over the task. BPL was only just kept in public ownership by an alliance of disparate arguments. Time had been lost, but by the end of 1982, the client brief had been fixed and costed, a design and build contract reputed to be the fastest track had been awarded, and detailed plans had been thrashed out with the contractors. I had no further input into the programme thereafter.
So he is saying this is far too... Sorry, the word far is wrong. This is too late.
That is, I think, a respectable reading of what he's saying, absolutely. And then essentially saying, by the time we get to 1982, then, as it were, it's on track.
So if you put the two paragraphs together, he's saying there's Dr. Biggs and Dr. Ritzer. They're constantly updating their projections. If you'd thought about that at the time, you'd have realised much more needed to be done much sooner.
Yes, and it's important to read the next paragraph as well. It's important to read this.
And when you might have had money to do it.
Yes, and if we go over the page to paragraph 170, he says this: I contend elsewhere that to prevent infections with HIV and at least staunch the surge of new HCV infections in the next generation, we would have to have had safe products before 1983. Even if heating had been more than a gleam in the eye in 1982, a 5-year programme of rebuilding BPL would have to have started in about 1978, not in 1982 as actually happened. The projections of UK need made about 1975 to 78 on the basis of Scottish demand, notably by Dr. Cash, were not taken seriously in England, except perhaps by some Hemophilia Centre directors. The one-off bounty in 1975 by the then Minister of Health was spread far too thinly. Very little reached BPL, and it did not stimulate even ground studies for a building commensurate with the task.
So he appears to be saying, well, if they'd listened to what was being said before 1978, it could have been done by 1983 and might have made a difference.
I think that's a respectable interpretation of what Dr. Smith said in these paragraphs in his statement. So that's Dr. Smith on self-sufficiency in his statement to this inquiry in 2020. If we can then just pick up just one very brief comment in one of the Penrose documents. So it's at PRSE 0002057. we looked very briefly at this document so that we could see what it was earlier. Dr. Smith's comments on the Penrose Inquiry C3 viral inactivation chronology. For present purposes, if we can just look at the bottom of the second page, the entry in the chronology at the bottom of the page for the 24th of November 1982 refers to a note for a meeting of the CSA, so Common Services Agency Blood Transfusion Service Subcommittee, and the Penrose Inquiry has set out in its chronology an extract from that document. If we go over the page, it's just a very brief comment by Dr. Smith that it may be instructive. So top of the page, it's the bit in italics. It may not have been clear to Dr. Cash and others in Scotland at that time that CBLA had only peripheral interest in blood transfusion in England and Wales and no formal links to the RTCs. CBLA administered only BPL and BGRL. So it picks up again on some of the hints and suggestions in the inquiry statement about the organisation and structure in England and Wales. We'll see when we look at Dr. Lane's draft proof of evidence at some point tomorrow. Dr. Lane deals with the question of self-sufficiency in considerably more detail in his 1990 HIV haemophilia litigation proof. So the second topic then is the question of knowledge of risks of hepatitis and AIDS. Now, obviously, we've heard a lot of evidence from clinicians about that. We've looked at a lot of contemporaneous material. Dr. Smith's evidence offers the fractionator's perspective. If we start with hepatitis and go to, again, the 1990 draft proof, so CBLA 5016_034, we pick it up at page 14. We can see a heading, the target viruses. And this was what Dr. Smith said in 1990, looking back as I read the statement to the early 1980s. Hepatitis B was at the time diminishing in importance because of much better screening, i.e. testing of donations, the impending introduction of vaccination against hepatitis B, and the immunity of haemophiliacs who had already been treated with concentrate and had, as a consequence, caught hepatitis B and recovered, leaving them with antibodies against further infection. Most severe haemophiliacs had received substantial amounts of factor VIII by this time and, having been infected, would have been immune from future hepatitis B infection. However, fractionators cannot rely on donor screening, since one failure through insensitivity of a test or an error might infect 100 haemophiliacs from a single batch. Most haemophilia centre directors probably recognise that hepatitis non-A, non-B was by this time a more frequent cause of hepatitis than hepatitis B, but the near 100% infection of first-time recipients with hepatitis non-A, non-B was realised only in 1983 after prospective ALT studies. At that time, the only way we could test for hepatitis non-A, non-B was through prospective tests, which involved taking serum samples every 2 to 3 weeks and testing the level of the transaminase enzyme. If the level was consistently higher than normal, it tended to mean the haemophiliac had hepatitis. Most haemophilia centre directors, Dr. Preston Sheffield, a notable exception, seemed to think that hepatitis non-A, non-B was not a very serious disease. Top of the next page. Rarely causing death, hardly ever giving clinical jaundice, and without the late sequelae of liver cancer or cirrhosis seen after hepatitis B. Now, pausing there. That's Dr. Smith setting out his understanding of what the clinicians in the field thought about non-A, non-B hepatitis and its seriousness. He then says in the next paragraph, fractionators were much more concerned, partly because of earlier awareness of potential product, sorry, can we just go up to the top of the page again? Of potential product liability cases. And then if we then just look at paragraph 37 under the heading virus inactivation, we get more of a sense then of what Dr. Smith was saying the view of fractionators was. He says, from the above, it would be true to infer that fractionators would want to be doing something about hepatitis transmission, but at the time it was not the top imperative, and by no means negligent to produce life-saving concentrates which might have unfortunate side effects, but without which a significant proportion of haemophiliacs would otherwise die or suffer severe joint injury. In other words, the risk/benefit ratio in favour of using such concentrates was still perceived as very low. Now, by whom he's suggesting that was perceived in that part of the paragraph is not clear, and obviously the perception of risk may be very different if you're the patient rather than the clinician, and maybe different still if you're the scientist. He then sets out some of the options for ameliorating hepatitis risk. I'm going to come back to those because he introduces ideas of pasteurisation and dry heating. But if we skip over that for present purposes, go to page 19. He says at paragraph 38, it was against this background in 1982 that thoughts were moving towards heat inactivation. As will be seen from the description above, this was only one of a number of potential routes. And then this is why I'm referring to it now, because it's about the understanding of non-A, non-B hepatitis. He says this: it must be remembered that the work was undertaken against the background of hepatitis B ceasing to be of much practical concern and hepatitis non-A, non-B not yet being recognised for the serious condition it later emerged to be. In the circumstances, virus inactivation, whilst desirable, was not an imperative. So two particular thoughts from this part of Dr. Smith's statement. Firstly, of course, it will be a matter for others to make submissions and for you to make decisions in due course, sir, about whether this perception of hepatitis, non-A, non-B hepatitis at this time was right, even viewed at the time, leaving aside any question of hindsight. We know with hindsight, obviously, it was wrong. And secondly, looking at the extent to which that view of non-A, non-B hepatitis of being not something to worry about too much, even in the early 1980s, what impact that had on the pursuit of different methods of viral inactivation.
Another way of putting the same point is to say that if people had thought, or should I say realised, depending on which view we want to take, that hepatitis non-A, non-B was a really serious disease, there would have been urgent research and viral inactivation would have been examined much more energetically than it was.
Yes, and that's undoubtedly, I'm sure, a submission that will be made to you and which you will need to evaluate and look at Dr. Smith's evidence as part of the material you look at. Of course, it's only right to observe that the work actually then involved in particular in identifying dry heating and indeed in finding a method HT3, as Dr. Snape describes them, which did inactivate non-A, non-B hepatitis. That is, Dr. Smith, as we'll see when we get onto heat treatment tomorrow, describes in some detail in his statements the amount of work that went into that. But obviously, sir, you're entitled to ask the question, if that had started significantly earlier, would that have made a difference? Still on the topic of understanding of hepatitis, if we then go to Dr. Smith's statement to this inquiry, WITN 3433001, if we pick it up at page 9, we can see paragraph 29, Dr. Smith's evidence. In the 1960s and 1970s, viral hepatitis was a threat to both those receiving multiple whole blood donations and to those receiving some products made from pooled plasma. Albumin did not transmit hepatitis following the discovery of protective agents which permitted virus inactivation by pasteurization. Normal immunoglobulin prepared by the cone cold ethanol process appeared not to cause liver disease. Fibrinogen was withdrawn from the US market in the mid-1970s because its few indications for use were being replaced by alternative treatments, and the risk of transmitting viral hepatitis, interpreted as hepatitis B, was too great. Single donor cryoprecipitate was becoming part of the repertoire of regional transfusion centres. So again, he's talking about the 60s and early 70s here, I think. Before the growth of cryo, the fraction used to provide factor VIII for haemophilia X was essentially the same as fibrinogen, except that it was commonly made from fresh frozen plasma in pools of fewer than 50 donations. However, the perceived balance of risk was quite different. And again, the question of who is doing the perceiving is obviously relevant here. Dr. Smith went on then to set out his own perception of the balance of risk as between treatment with treatments that might cause hepatitis and non-treatment by saying this: in untreated severe factor VIII deficiency, bleeds may be life-threatening or liable to lead to life-altering joint damage as well as being extremely painful. Even before donation testing for HBV became feasible at the end of the 1980s, physicians would almost always choose to treat haemophilia with a source of factor VIII, even if all that was available was FFP, rather than rely on palliative measures. They were aware that there was a finite risk of transmitting hepatitis, reflecting the incidence of infection in the donor population. The risk of HBV transmission did not greatly deter the use of whole blood in general transfusion practice. Once screening tests on blood donations had largely eliminated HBV from the blood supply, it was recognised that recipients of whole blood and of pooled plasma products, particularly first-time recipients, were still at risk of acute liver dysfunction. With the advent of reliable testing for HIV in 1974, following that for HBV in 1972, the agent responsible was judged to be another hepatitis virus, logically called non-A, non-B hepatitis virus, NANBH. As with HBV before donation testing, the risks of treatment were considered worth taking. Again, begs the question, considered by whom? But Dr. Smith is, I think, here talking about the perception of clinicians and not that of patients. In both blood transfusion practice and the treatment of haemophilia, and then this, which sets out his understanding of non-A, non-B. A crucial difference was that with the rare exception of acute fulminant disease, non-A, non-B hepatitis was universally considered to be an acute infection producing only relatively mild symptoms or none at all. Since symptoms were most commonly noted in first-time recipients, there was a suggestion that a first infection conferred a degree of immunity. There were few reports of serious chronic disease associated with non-A, non-B hepatitis until the 1980s. In interpreting the perceptions of physicians and patients in this period, and again, the extent to which Dr. Smith was in a position to interpret the perceptions of patients may be questionable. He may well have been better placed to have a sense of what physicians thought. I do not wish to imply complacency, but a rational risk-benefit assessment based on contemporary knowledge. He then, in the next paragraph, set out his own knowledge of the Edinburgh outbreak of viral hepatitis in the renal dialysis unit in 1969, which we've considered in other hearings. And then over the page, he says, in the late 1970s, certain factor IX concentrates were reported as carrying a high incidence of non-A, non-B in recipients. The reference there, which is WITN 3433003, perhaps we should just go to that. You've got that, Paul? WITN 3433003. If you haven't, don't worry. No, okay, well, we don't have that. What I can tell you, sir, is that, in fact, that's a publication in the Annals of Internal Medicine for October 1970, I think, rather than the late 1970s. And there's a letter relating to hepatitis after Co9. But we can check that. In any event, going back to the statement, in the UK, the incidence of infection from factor 9 concentrates was considered to be less than from factor 8 concentrates made from the same plasma pools of 500 to 1,000 donations. This comfortable assumption became untenable in 1978 to 9, when an alarming incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis, including acute fulminant fatal disease, was reported in patients receiving factor 9 concentrate for the first time for reasons other than haemophilia B. Such uses became less common, the risk-benefit being unacceptably higher in these situations than in haemophilia B. He then, in paragraph 35, talks about some proposals presented to Dr. Lane, which I'll come back to. And then in paragraph 36, he talked about the next blow to fractionators' confidence in their products came with the transmission of acute and sometimes fatal hepatitis in a group of patients taking part in the clinical trial of a new BPL intravenously administered immunoglobulin. We were left with the conclusion that our only product safe from hepatitis was pasteurised albumin. There was no reason to believe that other blood-borne viruses would not arrive in the blood supply to compound the problem. It would mean the end of our ambitions to provide a comprehensive array of plasma products for all who clearly needed them from the blood generously provided by the donors of our own country. It's very doubtful whether the production of albumin alone would justify the continuation of public service fractionation. Inevitably, our failure to provide safe concentrates would invite the arrival of products from other countries and other donor populations, whose viral status was almost certainly inferior to our own. So the two events which Dr. Smith described here as blows to fractionators' confidence were not discoveries of hepatitis in haemophiliacs, but in incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis in those receiving factor 9 concentrate for other reasons, and then the transmission of hepatitis to a group of patients involved in a clinical trial of an immunoglobulin. And then if we just go to the bottom of the page, he was asked the question, perfectly understandably, he says he wasn't sure what it meant, but then just in terms of his answer says this: fractionators and clinicians were not withholding any knowledge from each other. They were receiving the same, sometimes conflicting messages, e.g. about long-term liver damage associated with chronic non-A, non-B infection at the same time, but the impact was different. Fractionators were saying, we know that it keeps getting harder to justify using large pool coagulation products, and we are working to make your decisions easier, but there are gaps in our basic knowledge which make it difficult to get a toehold on testing and inactivation of non-A, non-B hepatitis. Meanwhile, clinicians had to make hard daily choices based on their own interpretation of the danger and make risk-benefit assessments on individual patients. Most would continue to recommend or use concentrates aware of the risks. Fractionators have no place in telling clinicians how to make these choices. And then you will see in the next question that was posed by the inquiry to Dr. Smith, reference was made to a description he gave in his Penrose evidence of Dr. Preston and others as Cassandras. That's a reference to the figure from Greek mythology whose accurate prophecies were not believed. And he was asked the question, do you have a view on why the opinions of Dr. Preston and the other Cassandras were not given more weight in the 1970s and early 1980s? And he said the term Cassandras was not intended to be pejorative. As I recall, Cassandra was ultimately right in her predictions, but received scant thanks for it. Our Cassandras faced much opposition, but their fate was less harsh. And then he said this: I recall lively debates in general and special conferences, as well as the medical journals, about the justification of liver biopsy in haemophiliacs, and pathologists' differing interpretations of what these samples were claimed to show. And then the reference there, sir, is to Dr. Preston's 1978 study. Most clinicians treating haemophilia were not seeing unusual incidences of late symptomatic liver disease, perhaps because they'd not been alerted to looking for it systematically. The ultimate consensus was that the majority of those infected with non-A, non-B hepatitis developed chronic hepatitis, and about 15 to 20% of those went on to have cirrhosis and other serious liver disease, usually after a delay of many years. Statistically, however, the largest studies indicated that morbidity and mortality from liver disease and haemophilia did not diverge significantly from those of the general population until combined HIV/HCV infections later became common. If we just go back to the previous page, and the reference there to lively debates in general and special conferences in the medical journals, I should note that Dr. Smith was present at the Glasgow Symposium that took place in the autumn of 1980. You'll recall, sir, we've looked at it with other witnesses. It was the Symposium on Unresolved Problems in Haemophilia, in which there was there's a record compiled by Dr. Forbes and Dr. Lowe of the contributions, both in terms of papers and the debate. And there was much discussion from Dr. Preston, Dr. Triger and others about issues relating to hepatitis and liver disease. So Dr. Smith was at that meeting. It's also relevant to note that either Dr. Lane or Dr. Smith quite often attended meetings of either the Hepatitis Working Party or the meetings of the UK Haemophilia Centre directors in the early part of the 1980s. So Dr. Smith, for example, was present at the Haemophilia Centre directors meeting in September 1980, October 81, and then again in 1984, autumn 1984 and February 1985. Dr. Lane was present at Hepatitis Working Party meetings and Haemophilia Centre directors meetings for the period 1980 through to 1983. So both Dr. Lane and Dr. Smith would have been aware of and listening to some of the discussions and debates that went on amongst the Haemophilia Centre directors and other clinicians. So that's Dr. Smith's evidence in relation to his understanding of hepatitis. Just perhaps two further references before probably we end for today. In his evidence to the Penrose inquiry, it may be more of the same, but still I think relevant to note. If we go to PRSE 0004045, this was the first written statement to the Penrose inquiry. And if we go to page 4, the paragraph that's in bold print and italicized under the sentence "I could deduce two main threads" begins this: "It is not sufficiently realised, even in the PR," that's the preliminary Penrose report, "how little pressure there was from the haemophilia treaters and patients to take non-A, non-B hepatitis seriously in this period before 1983. Now, pausing there, again, if we think of the position of patients, it's not clear to me the basis upon which Dr. Smith would have been able to reach any views about the position of patients. And of course, again, it begs the question of the pressure that might or might not be applied by patients will depend upon the information that their own clinicians are or are not giving to them. But in any event, Dr. Smith was perhaps in a position to have a sense about what haemophilia treaters were saying. And he emphasises there the absence of pressure to take non-A, non-B hepatitis seriously. He goes on to say most clinicians would have assumed that NHS concentrates were much safer from non-A, non-B hepatitis than commercial concentrates because of the unpaid donor source. The view that non-A, non-B hepatitis could have serious long-term sequelae was not widely held. Hepatitis B was thought to have been tamed by donation testing. There was a vaccine on the near horizon, 1984. It really took AIDS in 1983 to 4 to get the attention of the majority onto blood-borne viruses. Then he contrasts that with fractionators, so that paragraph's dealing with clinicians. Fractionators were much more concerned about non-A, non-B hepatitis, but this was always a very recalcitrant virus with no convincing markers until right at the end of the decade. We had very few tools at our disposal, especially for proving whether any attempt at inactivation had succeeded. We were also misled by persistent claims that there might be more than one non-A, non-B hepatitis virus. And then he goes on to talk about some of the work done at PFC, which we'll no doubt be exploring with Dr. Foster next week. Then, if we go in this same document, sorry if we have that back on screen, to page 28, I think. Sorry, if we can start with page 17. So this is one of Dr. Smith's supplemental notes. The first bullet point there is non-A, non-B hepatitis was widely perceived as a mild, transient illness with only very rare serious sequelae. And that's his first bullet point in a note addressing impediments to the development of heat treatment against non-A, non-B hepatitis. In other words, non-A, non-B hepatitis wasn't regarded as necessarily sufficiently serious to bring it higher up the agenda of the fractionators. And then the reference to Cassandra's is on page 28, just over halfway down the page, paragraph 11.95. This is Dr. Smith's commentary on the Penrose report. And he refers to several Cassandras being already in the ring, Preston, Minucci, i.e. those saying, no, non-A, non-B hepatitis is more serious than you're giving credit for. So I think that's probably given the time a convenient point to finish. There are a handful of contemporaneous documents relevant to hepatitis that I want to look at before turning to AIDS, but it will take more than a couple of minutes, so perhaps we could pick that up in the morning.
Okay, well, let's do that and come back at 10 o'clock tomorrow.